Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this meeting of the Shadow Open Market Committee. My name's Diana Furch-Scott-Rath. I head Economics 21, which is the Manhattan Institute's economics portal based in Washington, D.C. It's wonderful to come and see all of you here. It's wonderful to welcome the Shadow Open Market Committee, people who have come from places as far away as California and Boston, and other places also, to talk about the Fed's return to normalcy. And this is a very important topic, especially today when we got terrific employment numbers, 313,000 jobs created in February, the labor force participation rate up by 0.3 of a percentage point, and additional jobs, about another 59,000 jobs revised upwards created in December and January than we previously thought. So this is a perfect day to talk about what is the Fed going to do. Are wages rising high enough? How much is the Fed going to increase? And with that, I'd like to introduce Deborah Lucas, MIT professor, who is going to moderate our first panel, Evaluating Post-Crisis Monetary Policy.
So great. It was when we were on the phone discussing how today would go, we were discussing that, I guess, the opportunity of returning to normal would mean different things to different people. And so I think you're definitely going to hear this on this panel, because any return or any change is always an opportunity to try to get things better than they were before, but there's the risk that they will be worse. So without any ado, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists. They're each going to give a short presentation. After each presentation, we'll take a few questions from the audience, but then we'll put off the longer questioning until we're done with everything. And I think we're going to start out with Mickey Levy, who's going to be talking about the Fed forecast uncertainties and monetary policy. So take it away, please.
My paper is entitled The Fed's Economic Forecast, Uncertainty, and Monetary Policy. And I'll be referring to a few of the charts in the paper. So while economic forecasting is always very difficult, since 2008, 2009, the Fed's economic forecasts, as I show in my paper, have been inaccurate, and their pattern of errors have followed a clear pattern. And the Fed, which is now presuming the economy and finance are operating in a new normal, may catch the Fed and monetary policy flat-footed. From 2010 to 2016, those 7 years, the FOMC's midpoint forecast overestimated growth, actual growth, in all but 1 year. And in 5 of those years, and you could turn to chart number 1, in 5 of those years, actual growth fell below the lower band of the Fed central tendency forecasts in 4 of those years. It fell below, in 5 of those 7 years, actual growth was below the lower band of the Fed central tendency forecast, and in 4 of the years, actual growth was below the lowest forecast of any Fed member. And in 2017, the direction of the Fed's errors changed, where growth significantly exceeded the Fed's median forecast, and actually in 2017, growth exceeded the highest forecast of any FOMC member. So during this entire period, the Fed significantly and persistently underestimated the decline in the unemployment rate. So how does the Fed's forecast stack up? As I show in chart 4, the Fed's forecast track record is a bit below average compared to private forecasters. So if you take the blue chip economic forecasters, which is a compilation of 50 some odd private forecasters, the median or the midpoint blue chipper had the same direction of errors, but a little lower magnitude of error. The other thing that's interesting is the blue chip provides an average of their top 10 and bottom 10 forecasts, and it did a much better job of capturing actual outcomes, far superior to the Fed's central tendency forecasts. And so I think when we step back and look at the Fed's forecasting errors, they reflect this tendency to overestimate the stimulative impact of the unprecedented monetary policy that was in place well after the economy became self-sustaining, while underestimating the economic impacts of the government's tax and regulatory policies. And this led the Fed to be too easy, too long, and expanded the scope of monetary policy and led it to be way too slow to normalize. This raises the probability of the Fed being flat-footed, particularly what I see is beginning in 2017, this regime shift in regulatory policy, the growing web of regulations weighed down on confidence and business investment, and the shift in regulatory policy in 2017, I think those micro changes were inadequately reflected in the Fed's macro thinking and its macro model. And now, if you think currently, I think the Fed has its estimate for 2018, which it made in December 2017, I think is underestimating economic growth. And they have, in December, they raised their forecast for 2018 to 2.5%, but then going back to 2.1% in 2019, suggesting that the tax changes are, the tax reforms will have a modest and temporary impact using typical multiplier analysis of the change in the deficit, while, in my mind, understating the positive responses to the true reform measures on the corporate side. And so I think the Fed, once again, in its thinking and its modeling, does not pick up some of these non-monetary policies that clearly affect the economy. So here are some of my suggestions for the Fed on improving communications and forecasting. The Fed, through its 12 Federal Reserve districts, has better access to anecdotal evidence on the corporate side and the consumer side than any other forecaster in the world. And before every FOMC meeting, the district banks collect anecdotal evidence, talking to the CEOs on their board and in their district. I think much more could be done. And we don't know what happens with this. I mean, it is presented at the meetings, but is it incorporated into the Fed's forecast? And I think in this day and age of reliance on data, big data analysis, the Fed does not take full advantage of their access to anecdotal evidence. I think they should really focus on this a lot. Let me give you an example. I have conducted some research that shows that the NFIB survey responses show small businesses have identified government regulation as a critical element in their decision-making for expansion and investment. And that's changed dramatically. My empirical work shows that the decline in business concerns about regulation are closely linked to business confidence and investment. If I can do that, why can't the Fed with its hundreds and hundreds of economists, instead of working on nuances of its macro model that don't add up to, that cannot be providing that much value added, why don't they reallocate some of those very smart people to focusing more on the resources they have out there and have access to? Secondly, I think the Fed should reassess its forecasting procedures, how it develops the forecast, how it makes them public, and really what are the objectives of the forecast. Is there too much groupthink as the FOMC members develop their forecasts? Are outlier FOMC members constrained? Is the Fed's senior staff forecast too dominant in preparing the FOMC forecasts? Should the Fed's senior staff forecast be published on a more timely basis? Now it's published with a 5-year lag. I think all of these issues need to be addressed, particularly since everybody looks to the Fed's forecasts as forward guidance, and the Fed knows that and puts together its forecasts accordingly. Now, on communications, I think the Fed should, now the central tendency range is developed by every FOMC member, submits their forecast, they debate it for a day, they could resubmit their forecast, and then they take the 3 outside, and then they call the rest a central tendency. But that's not really a range, and many people in the marketplace misperceive what that forecast is. So I suggest the Fed prepare and publish an additional forecast that is derived from each FOMC member's forecast of a range that captures some probability of actual outcomes, maybe 80%, which leaves 10% on each side. And I think the Fed should communicate much more clearly that monetary policy influences intermediate term outcomes with little impact on the short run, acknowledge there are lags, and it really, they really should reconsider having FOMC members who are free to say whatever they want, comment within 15 minutes of an employment number coming out. That gives the wrong impression. Now, finally, on the Fed's perspective on the long run, take a look at chart 5, and you could see while the Fed has significantly reduced its estimate of long-run potential growth down to 1.8%, it has reduced even more significantly its estimate of the appropriate funds rate adjusted for the Fed's 2% inflation target. And so the Fed perceives, in this context, the Fed perceives it's operating in a new normal. And isn't this risky that maybe the new normal will have a lot of the characteristics of the old normal, and the Fed will be behind the curve, and in real time it's going to be very difficult to determine that. And here I'll just note that nominal GDP growth accelerated from about a 3.5% average annualized pace in the prior 5 years in the second half of 2017. And it looks like with the tax cuts, you very well should see 5% nominal spending growth. Sounds like a appropriate forecast for 2018, which would give you, something like 3% real growth and 2% inflation. But if that's sustained, the inflation pressures are going to mount. And so once again, I think the Fed needs to do a lot of soul searching about its forecasts, because, like it or not, these have a significant impact on their policy. And I really think in the current environment where there's clear economic momentum, and as new Fed Chair Jay Powell said, it looks like the headwinds have turned into tailwinds. the Fed really needs to do some soul searching so it doesn't get caught flat-footed in a costly way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me take a question or two, if there is one. Yes.
Mickey, thanks very much. That was very interesting. Eric Green here from Open Door Trading. I understand how hard it is to actually forecast the economy. I've been trying to do it for many, many years. When I think of the Fed's forecast, I always wonder if there's some sort of cheerleading bias, because when I think of what the Fed does, they do a lot of different things. But one of them is also to inspire confidence. And you know, if any Fed member were to actually forecast a recession or a downturn, that's effectively an admission that I really stink at my job. I'm so bad that I'm going to tell you how bad I am. I'm going to have a recession in 3 years. But I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts in terms of there being some sort of cheerleading bias percolating through these forecasts. Thanks.
Eric, the answer is I don't know on the real economy. I understand what you're saying about forecasting recession. That's a very low probability. And if you look historically, you know, the CBOs never forecast recession. The Feds never forecast recession. Vis-a-vis the FOMC's forecasts of inflation, I know the individual members either are or feel constrained by that 2% target. So I don't know the answer to your question, but this brings up, you know, I just generically toss your question into my assessment that the Fed needs to really do some rethinking, and is there too much groupthink, and are potential outliers among FOMC members in their forecasts, are they at all constrained? And I would like to see the Fed, in their effort to be transparent, do a better job at it in expressing all of their feelings.
Yes.
Thanks for a fascinating talk. Just first a technical question. Looking at the chart, I'm not sure how the top 10 and bottom 10 blue chip forecasters could both be right. They must have some answer there. You said they were both doing pretty well, but obviously they would be on either sides of it. And also, just a comment, just inherently from what you said, of course, the 50 blue chip forecasters, to some degree, we all know they do look over their shoulders at each other. But, of course, they have an inherent advantage in that they are more dispersed. And so you almost told us, just to comment on that, is that they're always probably going to be a bit better. But just my two questions. How do the top 10, bottom 10 better? And
Okay.
don't you think blue chip are always going to do better, given what you said?
Okay, I think there is this tendency for private forecasters to talk a big game and then have their forecasts kind of go towards some kind of acceptable range. But I think of the 50 blue chippers, they actually put together their forecasts more independently than the FOMC does. What I meant to say, or what I tried to say, is the blue chip every month, and by the way, you can subscribe to their service for $1,000 a year, and their forecasts over the last 8 years have showed lower error variance than the Fed's. If you take the blue chip publishes an average for the low 10 forecasters and the upper 10. And if you take those 2 points as a range, that's a nice range that captures more of what the actual outcomes than the Fed's central tendency. Now, keep in mind, the Fed's central tendency forecasts were never designed, and they aren't compiled to be a range, but they're oftentimes misperceived of as a range. And because the Fed knows and everybody else knows these forecasts carry a lot of weight as forward guidance, the Fed needs to improve, think about it, and communicate better.
Great. Okay, well, we can return to this interesting conversation later, but now Charlie Calamiris is going to talk about the failure to adopt a systematic policy.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And as we think about what it means to return to normal, I want to focus on the need to reestablish, and I want to emphasize reestablish and improve upon the intellectual commitment to having a systematic monetary policy. In fact, reflecting on the last 18 years or so, I think it's remarkable what a roller coaster ride the thinking about systematic policy has had within the United States especially. But I also in my remarks want to focus not just on that roller coaster ride, but also what it has meant for global markets, both the negatives and the positives. Because while I don't think that the Fed should be targeting the global economy, certainly not, I think that we as economists also must recognize that monetary policy has implications outside the U.S. too. So that part of the benefits, I'm going to argue, of a more systematic monetary policy would actually be shared globally, not just within the U.S. So let me reflect a little bit then on the trip that we've had and the prospects for reform, and I'll summarize what I'm going to say. I'm going to review where we were as of 2000 and how we've evolved since then in our thinking about systematic policy. And then I'm going to look at the consequences outside the U.S. and important casualties from the Fed's retreat toward unfettered discretion include three things. First, the politicization of monetary policy. Second, extreme dollar exchange rate instability. And third, confusion about the perception of a continuing need for unconventional monetary tools, such as interest on reserves and reverse repos. The silver linings have been mainly outside the U.S., enormous portfolio flows to emerging markets driven by carry trade that have actually had very favorable consequences for emerging markets, not just in the form of the investments that they've been able to achieve as a result of those capital flows, but also the foreign exchange rate volatility has actually created some, ironically, encouraged some improvements in emerging market monetary policies and fiscal policies. So actually, I would say that the funny thing is that the failure to adhere to a systematic policy, you might say, has had some short-term benefits, maybe some long-term benefits for emerging markets, but I think I'll explain why more broadly I don't think that that means that we want to continue with those policies. So let me begin then to talk a little bit about the trip we were on. Around 2000, in case you weren't paying attention, there emerged a broad consensus that was led by academics like Ben Bernanke that something like a flexible exchange rate targeting rule along the lines of some version of the Taylor rule would be an important improvement to policy. This was a victory of what I might call the rational expectations school view, that you can't make progress in society by systematically fooling people. And in fact, you're better off adopting a transparent, predictable, and empirically defensible rule that, first of all, targets inflation as the primary objective of policy at a very low rate, and secondly, has a secondary objective of some cyclical stabilization. Strangely, that consensus disappeared almost as soon as it was in place as a result, ironically, of Ben Bernanke's advocacy of extreme loosening of policy from 2002 to 2005. If you use the St. Louis Fed's formulation of this, the failure to adhere to the implicit Taylor rule that the Fed had been following for the previous 20 years put the Fed funds rate on average from 2002 to 2005 about 2 percentage points below the level that would have been consistent with following that rule. I think there's little doubt that this bubble inflating policy contributed to the unsustainable housing price rises that were part of the cause of the crisis of 2007. And then, of course, after the crisis, that ushered in a whole new phase of emergency and post-emergency monetary experimentation, quantitative easing, or QE1, QE2, QE3, reverse repos, forward guidance, interest on reserves. So these are all things that, as recently as 2003, 2004, 2006, you couldn't even have imagined, much less would have predicted. Now, these have been implemented, the emergency, starting really in 2002, we went into this new phase of ad hoc policy. And I think it's really kind of remarkable. It wasn't just produced by the crisis, it preceded the crisis. And it's hard to explain exactly why, what this phony deflation worry was that drove the Fed to depart from some kind of rule in 2002. But it's really been a long time. And it really, to me, it's remarkable that the adherence to the view that was espoused by people like Ben Bernanke and Rick Mishkin as of about 2000 was so short-lived. And ever since then, since 2002, the Fed has basically adopted a completely ad hoc lack of framework that's been guiding its actions. And it remains today adrift with nothing even approaching a systematic approach to policy. So let me make a few points about that. So I mentioned that one of the silver linings of this has been big capital flows to emerging markets driven by carry trade. That is, when the U.S. interest rates were very low for a long period of time, that tends to provoke investors to move funds to emerging markets. For example, in recent years, just the equity component of net inflows into emerging markets from developed countries has been about $100 billion a year. This has been, that one in particular, which is not the largest of the flows, debts are the larger component, but that has been an amazing source of investment funds in emerging markets. In a recent paper I did with Mauricio Lorraine and Sergio Schmuckler, we've argued that our best estimate of how much that affected equity issuances was about 50 cents on the dollar, and then about 90% of those equity issuances in emerging markets were used to finance fixed investment. So there is a silver lining if you're in the emerging markets of this carry trade. The effect on actual investment and new stock issues has been enormous. Another thing, even on the downside, when we had the beginning with the taper tantrum and then the huge dollar appreciation that happened in 2014 and 2015, of course, that created a backlash for emerging markets. Notice a few things. First of all, the investors don't get to take the equity money back. Unlike short-term debt, which you can decide not to roll over, those equity funds are gone. So are those long-term debt funds. They're not going to be coming back quickly. Now, at some point they may come back, but there was no sudden rush. But there was a lot of discipline coming from short-term debt. And that discipline had a silver lining too. Although there was a lot of volatility and turmoil in 2013 to 2014, one of the good things that came out of that was it prompted people to recognize that this wasn't uniform across emerging markets. It was affecting some countries more than others. And in fact, a lot of research has pointed toward weaknesses in those countries' institutions, their fiscal policy institutions and others, that predicted which countries were suffering the worst kind of withdrawals of capital. And actually, we can see in lots of cases, Brazil and Indonesia are the two most obvious ones, but there are lots of other examples. I'll talk about Mexican monetary policy in a minute, where the response to that has actually been long-term improvements in emerging market institutions. So you could say, both on the upside in terms of the new capital that was made available during the boom, and even on the downside through long-term improvements in institutions, reacting to the withdrawal of funds, that emerging markets have really had a very interesting and good ride. However, I think that while true, that neglects just how unsettling it has been to experience dollar value unpredictability from outside the U.S. So from about 2009 to the present, the dollar on a trade-weighted basis has been moving within an interval of about 35%. So this is an unbelievable amount of dollar unpredictability. And in fact, in a recent study that Harry Mamaysky and I have done, we looked at how hard it was to predict exchange rates for about 30 countries with a one-year time horizon. We found that prior to the era of monetary experimentation, let's say starting around 2010, I'm going to say, for most of the world, having to do with the expansion of QE. We could predict exchange rates quite well. So let's say the typical one-year forecast for an exchange rate, we could get about an R-squared net regression of about a quarter. When QE was introduced in the US and elsewhere, in other developed countries, it made the entire regression for the entire period, the R-squared, fall to about 8%. When you put the central bank's balance sheets into the regression, it went back to 25%. So in other words, all of the exchange rate unpredictability that happened since 2010, which was an enormous amount of new exchange rate unpredictability, is traceable to central bank balance sheets. Now, what was going on there? I'd say two things, and this is really key to my point about the need for systematic policy. The first thing was, nobody knew, once QE had started, how it was going to end. So there was no sense of a mapping from where the state of the economy was to what central bank balance sheets would do. And so you had no ability to forecast exchange rates based on this very important variable, this new variable, which was central bank balance sheet growth. There was no clear exit that was formulated and known in advance. Secondly, central banks were offsetting, to some extent, each other's actions, which also made the exchange rate very unpredictable. Now, the other central banks weren't offsetting the U.S. actions completely. If they had, then there would have been no dollar depreciation prior to 2013 and no dollar appreciation afterwards. They didn't offset them completely, and I think so. But there still was an element of competitive devaluation and uncertainty coming from that. Yeah. Now, in places like Mexico, what's interesting in monetary policy is the Mexicans actually sort of gave up on trying to have exchange rate promises and targeting as part of their monetary policy framework, partly because of the extreme volatility. So again, another sort of silver lining of the extreme volatility was that the idea of trying to maintain flexible inflation targeting rather than making promises in exchange markets that you can't keep seems to have improved in emerging markets as a result of that volatility. But again, I'm looking for silver linings, not for an ideal monetary system. In fact, it's kind of strange that here, in the country that founded the Bretton Woods system, ostensibly to prevent devaluations, that we have made competitive devaluation a worldwide phenomenon of best practice of monetary policy for the last several years. It's very, very strange. Now, you might say, well, that was just an omission. Well, it turns out it wasn't. So in a conference I was attending at the Riksbank, one of the prominent Fed staffers from the board was there and said, well, of course, the devaluation was the main mechanism for making monetary policy work. I was stunned because, first of all, in the Fed, you're never supposed to admit that you're trying to affect the value of the dollar, right? And secondly, I thought competitive devaluation was something that we weren't supposed to be doing. So I thought it was very strange that the Fed actually intended this as one of the primary mechanisms of the transmission of monetary policy to help promote growth. I'm at the end of my time, so I'll just mention a couple of things. I also talk in this very briefly about politicization of monetary policy. I think that's a very important problem, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. And I just want to close by saying we're also in a situation where people actually seem to believe that we need tools other than open market operations to produce monetary policy, just based on the path we've been on. That's really a political convenience. We are using reverse repos and interest on reserves because we don't like the balance sheet consequences, the political consequences of changing the Fed's balance sheet with traditional operations. There's no reason not to go back to open market operations. And I think that's another part of the Fed learning that needs to be unlearned, that they now seem to believe they can't operate without open market operations. I think that's wrong. So if we're going to go back to prevent this, what do we need to do? We need to establish systematic rules, but I want to emphasize one thing in particular. We need to make sure that the zero lower bound is part of our systematic rule. We need to say, if we hit the zero lower bound again, we will enter QE under the following circumstances. We will grow our balance sheet according to the following rule, and we will exit it according to the following rule, to avoid the kinds of disruptions and exchange rate volatility we've had. And I think those are the things, we don't need to say, no, we'll never do QE again. No, if we hit the zero lower bound, we very likely will. We need to make that clearer to avoid a lot of these adverse consequences that we're still living with. Thank you.
Yes, let's just take one question right now, because I think the next conversation is going to speak to it too, and then we can have more time for the audience. But
before we can adopt new rules, I think we need to exit from what they've just created. And as you said, from 2002 to 2005, they were 2% below a Taylor rule, and we know how that ended. Well, after 2008, they go to ZIRP and they go to QE, and I don't think we've seen how that has ended yet because they don't have an exit strategy, as you said. The only exit strategy that I can see, given these huge imbalances and maybe financial bubbles they've created, is that they're going to be gradual. Well, imbalances keep growing while they're trying to be gradual. So maybe you can, before we go to the new rules that need to be adopted, tell me how you think they can exit this without another accident.
I will just say one thing about that for now, and I'm sure we'll be revolving around this for the next few minutes. I think that this point you made about wanting to be gradual, when you don't have a framework, you're stuck with being gradual, goes part of the way for understanding Mickey's results about persistent failures in forecasts, because part of the role of the forecast is to justify the actions. And when you're in a situation where you don't have a rule, you kind of just want to go slow, make incremental changes. Part of what that does is it affects your internal forecasting. And I do think you're right that this, in the absence of a rule that could justify a dramatic change, you won't make dramatic changes. That, I think, is a very powerful insight. By the way, yesterday there was a paper by Steve Sharp from the Federal Reserve Board that showed, really, I thought remarkably, that if the Fed had used its own Green Book language properly, if it had, notice the Green Book is the own internal view of the Fed staff. What the staff did was they did a textual analysis of the Fed's Green Book going back to the 70s through 2003. And they found that you could remarkably improve Fed growth forecasts for 4 quarters out in GDP if you just actually paid attention to what the staff said. So it's clear that these mistakes that Mickey's pointing to and that you're pointing to do have something to do with purposely, I would say, putting sand into the gears. So I think it's a very insightful point that in the absence of a systematic policy, you're stuck with this kind of gradualism, which of course means you're flat-footed, and that's the biggest risk right now.
good. Well, let's move on, and I think there's going to be a lively discussion between the two of you. So Athanasios Orphanides is going to be talking about monetary policy normalization should be more systematic and less wobbly. New technical term.
I'm tempted to start by already responding and disagreeing with the questions and the answers already, but let's not do this right now. I will actually follow up on both what Mickey has talked about, the Fed's forecast, and what Charlie has talked about. This is joint work with Gregory Hess, who unfortunately couldn't come due to the storm. So he started in Africa, and instead of making it to New York, he ended up in San Francisco. Couldn't come here. Once a flight gets canceled, then you have to wait another day. It gets messy. So our starting point will actually be the change of the guard at the Federal Reserve, because the Powell era begins in interesting times, in the usual, for these discussions, sense of interesting times. The change of the guard that we're observing just now is associated with challenges of what hasn't been done and what is left unanswered along the lines of what Mickey has been describing before in trying to understand what the economy is doing, and also opportunities for improving the way the Fed operates going forward. So these are the two things I want to talk about. I'm going to start with the obvious challenge. Chair Yellen has left the economy in good shape, and I think this is something that has to be recognized, even though the forecast record has been not excellent, quite bad compared to other eras, actually. I don't think the Fed was on its own in having difficulty understanding the evolution of the economy. But despite that, we actually have an economy that is at full employment or beyond full employment. Some would argue. I would argue that too, recognizing the uncertainties of measuring full employment. At the same time, inflation is approaching the Fed's 2% stated target, which is very good under the circumstances. So the challenges are, number one, it's not clear if we got here in large part because we got lucky, despite the fact that we do not understand as well the dynamics of inflation, and we appear to understand less well the links between the real economic activity and inflation that we used to a generation ago. And I'm going to start describing this chart with figure 1 that I've distributed. What figure 1 does is it shows the FOMC's forecast from the SEP from the fourth quarter of every year since 2011. Those are the red lines for the two variables that the Fed associates with fulfilling its mandate. Mickey talked about them as well. If you look at the unemployment rate, for example, the Fed has been systematically missing. This is not just 1 year out, you go 2 years out in this forecast, has been systematically missing on the economy. The unemployment rate has been coming down systematically much faster than the Fed would have predicted. But the real puzzle is when we combine this with the forecast errors we observe on inflation. Because the usual story and the usual way of thinking, and when most Fed speeches are along these lines as well, is to talk primarily about aggregate demand shocks. We can have aggregate demand shocks that actually have the unemployment rate be lower than expected. That's fine, shocks happen. But if this was the main driver of what we observe, we would have expected inflation to be systematically higher than what the Fed has been forecasting. What you're going to see in comparing this is that the Fed has been forecasting systematically higher inflation than what we actually got, which suggests a real problem in the understanding of how we link economic activity and inflation. This is not a good time to try to be fine-tuning economic performance, since we have such lack of understanding of the basic links of the two aspects of the Fed mandates. So this is one element. The other element is that, as Charlie pointed out, Chair Yellen is leaving has left the Fed with the economy in very good shape, but without really any clarity on the systematic manner in which we would want to know the Fed would respond to future developments in the economy. And you realize this is much more dangerous and much more challenging for a new chair if we have a worse understanding of the links between inflation and unemployment and of the structural changes that have been undergoing on in the economy in the last several years. But there is another issue that makes the situation more fragile. And this will take me back to work that Marvin Goodfriend had done when he was at the Richmond Fed. I recall while inside the system, and this is because I want to tell both to Mickey and to Charlie, there is fantastic work that is being done inside the system. So Marvin at the Richmond Fed did such fantastic work, for example. And he had written a beautiful paper on inflation scares and on trying to understand what can go wrong if the credibility of the Federal Reserve is challenged. And he had documented in this paper, that was written in the 1990s, that we had actually observed inflation scares soon after Paul Volcker got appointed, even though Paul Volcker regained a lot of the Fed's credibility and brought inflation down tremendously. And let me remind you the interpretation of what happened when Chair Greenspan was appointed, the second half of 1987. And I'm not sure many of you will characterize the second half of 1987 as a fantastic time of a credible Fed guiding smoothly the markets. And Marvin had identified that as being associated with an inflation scare, which was actually there about a month or so after Greenspan's was appointed, which actually probably was one of the factors that led to the October crash, because you had this increase in volatility in bond markets, and then we saw in the stock markets as well. And where was all of this coming from? The fact that we had a new chair who turned out, much like Volcker, I think Greenspan turned out to be fairly good chairs of the Federal Reserve, and they actually controlled inflation fairly well. But how were we to know? Since the Fed had refused at the time, as it still does, to provide to all of us a systematic approach to policy so we can figure out how we'd be responding to future shocks. So this makes the current environment for the new chair more fragile than is widely recognized. And let me have 2 more minutes to point out why this is even worse now than it was in the periods when Marvin Goodfriend was describing before. And I want you to have a look at figure 2, where I describe the Fed's current, this is a summary of the Fed's current communication of where policy is headed. So the Fed has tried in the last few years, this has started with Chair Bernanke, to provide the appearance of being more transparent and systematic. One of the elements of that we're very well familiar with, for example, is the publication of the dots, which I actually have them on the left-hand side panel of figure 2 as red dots. And the dots I have here are from the latest SEP from December, and this is supposed to give us some guidance on Fed policy going on. And I'm not going to have the asterisks and the explanations about how we should interpret and not interpret this, but I'll highlight something else. As Charlie pointed out, and this is the critical point, we are now in a world where the interest rate is no longer the only relevant instrument for understanding monetary policy. Coming out of the zero lower bound situation that we find in the last few years, and actually following how the Fed has been using both interest rates and the size of the balance sheet as important elements of policy, it's really critical to have good communication about both interest rates and the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. Now, my preference would be to go with a systematic rule, but let me actually point out to you what the Fed has been doing more recently in communicating this. The left-hand side of figure 2, I show them dots. They can say at the Fed that they are giving us plenty of guidance on policy, but then I was trying to figure out, so what is the guidance on what's going on with the balance sheet? And the only thing I can find beyond the statement of gradual unwinding of the balance sheet is the analysis that was published by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York last year that says, well, we know we can have different scenario about how large our balance sheet is going to be in a few years. You know, $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. You know, the FOMC hasn't decided yet. Well, be patient. We'll get to this. I'm looking at this and saying, what do you mean? You know, it actually matters quite a bit for my understanding of what the policy stance is to know if I'm going to have this $1 trillion here or $1 trillion there. You know, how come you can simultaneously say that you're so transparent and not provide this key piece of information? So I'm gonna end by saying that this is a great opportunity for Chair Powell and the new guard at the Fed. And it's a great opportunity to really go back. So my advice would be go back, and I see Charlie Plosser is in the room. And my advice explicitly would be go back to the discussions that Charlie had initiated at the FOMC before he left, and start from Charlie Plosser's arguments at the FOMC about the direction the Fed should go about designing systematic policy and implement this year. And that would reduce the fragilities and make us all be more certain about the Fed going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's open it up for questions for everyone. We can start over here.
The gentleman who just spoke, I was intrigued by your statement that in your view we have more than full employment, and that you probably would be familiar, no doubt, with the view that, look, we have still a very low labor force participation rate, so potential for people to come into the labor force. In addition, the measure of labor underutilization, known as U6, is unusually high still in relation to the current official unemployment rate. So presumably we have some slack in the labor market left. But you disagree, so could you explain why?
Yeah, so let me just point out that I don't want to belabor the point of how we exactly estimate what the full employment metric is that the Fed should be using. Based on historical analysis I'm familiar with, it's incredibly difficult to actually pin down a number. But I don't want the Fed to repeat errors of the past. So if you go back to Fed documents from the 1960s, for example, you see a situation where the unemployment rate was similarly low. And I remember vividly being shocked when I read a congressional hearing of board governors claiming in December of 1965 that yeah, we can safely take the unemployment rate down to 3.5% and maybe 3%, and yeah, we should push for that. And yes, yes, Senator, yes, we hear you, and this is what the Fed should be doing, because I know from the history of the Fed that this sort of behavior tends not to produce good results. So my advice would be to actually have the Fed staff. The Fed staff is best equipped to do this, to identify a policy rule that would take into account uncertainties about this concept and the structural issues we have in the economy, and announce what that rule would be so that the FOMC could be guided and be more systematic going forward without really pinning as to whether the natural rate of unemployment is 4.3 or 4.6 or 4.0. This shouldn't matter.
Hi, Guy Hazelman. I'm curious, you said about how critically important it is for the Fed to maintain credibility. And I'm just curious how that should be defined. You could say their ability to achieve their dual mandates, but to me there's a time inconsistency that, having excessive over-easing works in the short term, but you may be sacrificing the long run. You may be creating, lower employment and economic growth, but then if you ultimately either get inflation or you end up having financial bubbles that then pop and push us into a recession, it actually becomes counterproductive. So how would you define credibility over the Fed, given what happened from '02 to '05, and as Mickey would suggest, either an economic model, a groupthink that kind of failed and it didn't end well?
Yeah, and actually I can see that after this question, maybe we could start a discussion here, because I'm going to start by pointing out that there is a slight disagreement I would have with a statement about, say, the early 2000s. Are we certain that monetary policy was overly easy in the 2000-2005 episode, for example? Well, tell you the truth, personally, and based on research I've done, I'm not that certain at all. In my view, we had a terrible miss on the regulatory part of policy. Terrible miss on that one. I don't think monetary policy was not calibrated very well or not in accordance with a reasonable rule. But I do have the following problem, which will address your question. I wish the Fed had clarified what the rule is. It's entirely appropriate to ease monetary policy and ease monetary massively if the economy is hit with a negative shock. But as you point out, and as Charlie was pointing out before, we always need to keep an eye in the long run. If you have a systematic approach to easing monetary policy when you need to, the fact that you have the rule pins down the long run and guides you about how you unwind the policy easing at the same time. So there is no inconsistency between easing policy in response to an adverse shock and maintaining long-term stability, as long as you are willing to adopt and explain a policy rule, and of course with the proviso that you do the work that is necessary to select a rule that works reasonably well.
Can I also say something about that? I don't think we're going to disagree that much, Athanasius, about this, because I do think the Fed was wrong in what it did in 2002 to 2005. It was mistaken in its concerns. And if you remember back to what Rick Mishkin said, he tried to describe what the Fed was doing. And it's one of the more neglected speeches, I think. I think it's really worth going back and reading this speech. He says, you shouldn't necessarily target your midpoint. In other words, Fed, what? You shouldn't be targeting based on a kind of coefficient analysis in midpoints. You should be worrying about the tails. That was a speech that a governor of the Fed gave, my colleague, Rick Mishkin, saying that, we're really worried about tail risk right now. And so for now, we couldn't really, forget about the coefficient values of a rule. That isn't what's at issue. So I think that it wasn't just a coincidence that the Fed didn't articulate a rule, that the Fed really, if you remember the way Ben Bernanke was giving speeches trying to jawbone the bond market at that time, and you read Rick Mishkin's speech, what they're basically saying is, we all knowledgeable wizards know about something that's not part of a model that you could write any coefficients down from. It's just about this black swan. Now, of course, they created the black swan, but they were worrying about one. So I think you're right, Athanasius. And in fact, I wouldn't fall if they had come up with some kind of framework and said, here's what we're doing. And even if it had been wrong, well, that would have been something that could be corrected and learned about, because we'd see the mistake from their having articulated the framework. But what they did was quite purposely not to articulate a framework, so they couldn't possibly be proven wrong, because they were wizards. They don't need to be articulating frameworks. That was the undefensible action done by the two people who had just 3 years before published a book saying the exact opposite. So what that shows is that economists are not trustworthy, that they believe in rules only as they apply to people other than themselves.
Can I make a point? With regard to the Fed's credibility, let me just add one concern, and that is the Fed has broadened the scope of monetary policy. And we noted under Chair Yellen, there was a significant increased focus on labor markets, U6, all these other things. And a concern I have is by extending monetary policy beyond its natural scope of what it's capable of, it leads the public, and you see this every day in the newspaper, that the Fed perceives its role as managing the real economy, and that subjects the Fed to another dimension that could jar its credibility. Okay, I disagree with you, Athanasios. Okay, and I think the Fed's mistake in 2002 is, keep in mind, in all years prior to 2002, the Fed and everybody else was looking down to 2% inflation. If we could only get it down to 2%. And then, following the mild recession of 2001, core inflation did fall to 1, and I think the Fed's mistake is they and Greenspan, speech after speech, overstated the downside economic impact of the small probability of deflation, even though inflationary expectations were closer to 2. And this led the Fed to, and then Bernanke, as governor, followed up with Greenspan, talked about how to conduct monetary policy when facing the zero bound, and that's what led the Fed to, I think, keep monetary policy rates too low too long. And I would add one other point. It wasn't the cause of the debt-financed housing bubble. It was not. But it facilitated some behavior that might not have occurred had the Fed been a little more even-handed in its policies.
So we have a lot of people who want to speak, but you were going to go through.
Thank you. A couple of thoughts, and I appreciate if you can expand on one is this rule vis-a-vis guardrails. And I'm a little confused when I'm listening to all three of you talking about a rule as if hard and fast rule. Maybe I'm misinterpreting it. It's because, for example, in the case where the cat is kind of out of the bag, where we have not just the United States having unconventional monetary policies, but globally. And when you think about rule, it cannot just simply, I assume, be very domestic-oriented. The framework is really global. And yet, of course, we don't have the kind of tools to control the rest of the world, how they are going to express in their own self-interest. So I appreciate thinking how you think about the rule, which makes sense to provide transparency and all those. Are you really talking about really sort of a guideline, the guardrails, to think about it rather than a pure rule of transparency? We'll act this way if it is this happened and this happened and this happened. So that's one. Number two, Dr. Levy, I appreciate your thought on talking about how the Fed has continuously overestimated or underestimated, whatever that may be, and not necessarily given a good grade for what they have projected. However, are they not human and subject to behavioral biases? Things that I think about as analysts, they think that you're going to do well as a corporation. You're going to keep doing well until it turned the other way. So we're always lacking because we're human. So we select the data that favors our view because it's a safer view. I appreciate you sharing how your frame of a rule that will overcome human biases of directionality. Thank you.
If I can take the first one, first question. In the paper I circulated, I cite a paper from 2002 written by Maurice Obstfeld and Ken Rogoff in the Journal of Political Economy. It's called Global Implications of Self-Oriented National Monetary Rules. That paper answers your question. So let me tell you what I think that paper says. It says that the best way to achieve global stability is for national monetary authorities to follow their own domestic flexible inflation targeting rules. And that in particular, exchange rate volatility will not be a problem that requires any additional monetary policy actions beyond that. It's a very important paper, and it specifically deals with games that are played among central banks that could lead to very great volatility having to do with competitive devaluation. So I think one of the lessons of that paper, logically, is that we actually can achieve a very predictable global environment if we actually have the Fed stick to focusing on a domestically focused monetary policy rule. And when I say rule, I mean algebraic formula that maps observables into policy actions. It can change and should change over time, but it must be a mapping from observables into actions, or else it's meaningless.
And if I may expand on this one, I actually have a slightly more flexible interpretation of a rule in that I would be willing, indeed, encourage using short-term forecasts in simple policy rules in order to be able to keep them simple. As long as the forecasting process is fairly transparent, so we can see that it's not gamed. Of course, forecast misses are okay. Shocks happen. But you can tell if you observe a forecaster operating over a couple of years if the forecasts are honest or are being gamed. As long as they are honest, they're fine. So I would expand the rule in that direction. And then I want to go back to one of the elements that was noted. We are humans, and indeed, I think this is what makes excellent professors behave differently when occasionally they become policymakers. And as Charlie pointed out, the transition makes some of them not as trustworthy as they were when they were just professors at the universities. These are the human biases, but what do we know about human biases? Human biases is exactly one of the key reasons why discretionary policy is so dangerous. And we know how to fix this. If only we can convince the policymakers with those human biases to assign to their staff, and at the Fed you have incredibly well-equipped staff to map what a good policy rule is that would actually bind the policymakers while incorporating their understanding of the economy and their preferences about how to best meet the Fed's dual mandate, since we have a dual mandate right now, and protecting them from the human biases of selecting which indicator will be used in order to justify another discretionary action. So this is precisely why it's important to move in that direction.
Go ahead. And then Charlie.
Okay. Anne Marie Mueller and I. Looking back on a long history of Shadow Open Market Committee meetings, I have attended or read about very few that have not argued against the Fed's tendency to whatever they were calling it at the time, discretion or gradualism and so forth. And yet it goes on. And each generation of SOMCs, of people plus academics, keep arguing it shouldn't. And somehow we're missing something, and it's in all this business about there being human and having inevitable human biases, that somehow, if we're ever going to have a rule that works, it's got to be a rule that makes people comfortable in thinking they're making their own decisions. Because otherwise, we'll have another X number of years of the same battle going nowhere. But one observation about the 70s, which are being insufficiently studied, I think, these days, because there are too many people running around saying inflation's a good thing and giving the argument that was very popular in the late 60s and early 70s of, a little more inflation will grease the wheels and it'll avoid the damage and so forth. The 70s took out of the profession, it's creeping back in, and that the Fed should worry about that. But I want to comment that the Fed in the 70s thought they had a rule. and that they had a monetary target, and they were supposed to raise the funds rate if the target was running, if money was running above that target, and lower it if it was running below. And yet they systematically cheated so that the target was not binding and resulted in a decade of terrible policy. So we need to think a bit more about what does a rule mean, and how can you fight the tendency to subvert it?
Let me take this question in two steps. First of all, I think we need to recognize that progress has been made. So the Fed has been moving slowly. But let me take you back to the very important step of announcing that 2% is the Fed's definition of price stability. I consider that to be a huge positive step relative to not even saying what it is that you mean by price stability. So progress has been made in that regard. That actually is one step to becoming more systematic. It's just that it's not enough, and the question is how to move beyond that. With respect to the 1970s and the rules, this is why both Charlie and I have insisted here. We're not going to accept something that the Fed claims to be a rule if it's obvious that it can be gamed so incredibly easily. And in terms of the 70s, let me remind you, the Fed was kind of grudgingly forced to announce monetary aggregates after the failure of the 1960s in its policy. And when it was forced to adopt monetary aggregates, it says, oh, you know what? We're going to give you half a dozen of them so that we have the discretion to always find one that is according to what we think the right policy is. And I highlight this because this is one of the approaches that I see being proposed these days is why don't we have the Fed specify half a dozen or, hey, more, maybe a dozen different rules, make sure one of them always gives you the discretionary answer that they want, and say this is it. Again, I think we have evolved in the last generation, so we can tell that wouldn't quite be a satisfactory solution. There are solutions, progress can be made. We just need to make sure that we keep the discussion going.
I also want to comment briefly on this. And I think I'm going to channel both Milton Friedman and Alan Meltzer in my response to you. So, and it's very similar in some ways to what Athanasius just said. It's not good enough for the Fed to have a rule. It must articulate a rule that it can be held accountable for externally. And so if you think about what Milton Friedman said, one of the most important consequences of the rule is that it protects the Fed from political attacks. That having the rule gives the Fed something to say in explaining to its political masters why it's not going to do what they want. So it's very important that it be a rule that's stated, publicly known, and that makes the Fed both accountable and defensible. That was, I think, Friedman's biggest argument, I would say, in my mind, for a rule. And then what does Meltzer tell us about that? That was the problem in the 70s, because Arthur Burns gave in to Nixon. They may have had a rule, but he kept being perfectly happy violating it to do Nixon's bidding. If he had had an externally stated rule, that could have protected the Fed, maybe. At least it would have embarrassed them when they did it.
There also was an underlying philosophy that said inflation was okay, that created an internal bias in favor.
I'm not disagreeing with that as a contributor to the story, but I still think that what you're seeing is a politicization problem. Remember, Meltzer basically said both what you're saying and what I said. He said that the two things that made the Fed constantly make errors is it had the wrong model, that's your point, and it was politicized. I think the 70s were both.
So we're going to give Charlie the last word as an honorary SOMC member.
Thank you, Debbie. It's fun to be back here sitting in the audience. I co-chaired this group for, 10, 12 years, something like that. I want to make 2 points. One, I want to go back to 2002, 2003, and the Fed's period there. The Shadow Open Market Committee had several sessions on deflation. Personally, I wrote a paper entitled "Deflating Deflationary Fears," and I think it's still on the website. You can go find it. But we had several sessions about concerns about Fed policy during that period, and that they were being too aggressive and too easy, and that could come back to haunt them. So that's just kind of a historical. The other point I want to make is about the Fed's projections. And I want to remind people that the Fed's projections, and I guess I take some responsibility for this, Fed's projections are not really projections. They are questions for the committee members to say, give me your assessment of the forecast of the future based on what you think is optimal or the best monetary policy. The committee is not being asked to make the best projections unconditionally on what GDP is going to be. So in that sense, the forecasts that come out of the SEPs are a very different animal than what comes out of the blue chip. And I think we have to be very careful and not elevate those forecasts to somehow they're making forecasts of the economy. What I had suggested, and which I think is perhaps maybe still under discussion, somebody asked me one time, they said, well, you know, here's your projection, and everybody's forecasting long-term 2%, which why would an FOMC member ever forecast something against their target? It just doesn't make much sense. But I said, the question, really interesting question, though, that can be learned from the SEPs that are not, is that matching up the predictions or assumptions about monetary policy that each member has, using those numbers in combination with the GDP numbers and unemployment numbers to get an understanding of what, revealing in some sense, that committee members' reaction function implicitly. Mm-hmm. And so if somebody asked me about my projections, I would say, well, I would have reported a very different set of projections if you had told me to use a different path of monetary policy. In other words, if you said, predict what the FOMC is going to do and give me what you think the forecast is under that. But that's not the question that's being answered. So I just want to remind people that these SEPs are more than just simple forecasts, and that they are more subtle than that. And we could improve transparency. Not we, it's not we anymore. The Fed could improve transparency if they were to reveal the whole matrix of forecasts and policy choices. That would actually be very interesting. Not as transparent as announcing the rule, but again, a step in the right direction. So I just want to offer some caution about comparing. And Mickey did this, and I think he had some side comments that sort of. I think Mickey understands this, but comparing them to blue chip forecasters is really not. They're not forecasting the same thing. So it's not surprising that they don't do as well in an unconditional sense. So that's all.
Charlie, excellent. Fair enough. And now everybody in this room knows more about the subtleties of the Fed's SEPs. Okay. Now, the Fed needs to communicate those to the public, what they are, because I guarantee you after the next FOMC meeting, when the SEP, the new updated SEPs are made public, every Wall Street forecaster is going to write down the numbers as the forecasts, and they do provide valuable forward guidance. And then I think the Fed has done a little better job on, their quote-unquote projections of the appropriate federal funds rate, and they've described what appropriate is. But I think the Fed has a long way to go, and this would add to its credibility that we're not in the forecasting business, but here's what they are. But I really appreciate your comments.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We can continue the conversation over a short break. Thanks again to the panel.
Very nice.